Grace Lee Whitney, best known to generations of devoted Star Trek fans as Yeoman Janice Rand, the poised, blonde-haired assistant to Captain Kirk with the signature beehive and quiet sense of duty, lived a life behind the scenes that was far more complicated, painful, and courageous than her brief 8-episode appearance on the legendary sci-fi series ever revealed. Because while fans watched her deliver reports, share soft gazes with William Shatner's iconic Kirk, and walk the halls of the Enterprise with silent strength, what they didn't know, and what took decades to come to light, was that Grace was struggling with private demons and an invisible trauma that shaped her sudden and mysterious disappearance from the show. A show that promised a future of equality, justice, and unity among the stars, but in reality reflected many of the darker truths of the 1960s entertainment industry, where behind the glimmer of sound stages and scripts, powerful men operated unchecked, and young women, missishly beautiful, talented, and ambitious ones like Grace were often left to suffer in silence when they were mistreated, used, or discarded. And what fans were never told at the time was that Grace Lee Whitney wasn't written off for ratings or plotlines, but was abruptly removed from the cast following a traumatic incident involving a powerful studio executive, a sexual assault that would stay buried under shame and studio silence for more than 30 years, until Grace, after enduring years of addiction, homelessness, depression, and emotional isolation, finally found her voice again and revealed in her powerful memoir, The Longest Trek, My Tour of the Galaxy, that she had been assaulted in a locked office during production and fired just days later, not for any creative reason but for daring to be vulnerable and for becoming, in the eyes of the system, inconvenient. And in the years that followed, the pain of being removed from the show she loved, combined with the trauma she'd endured, pushed her into a spiral of substance abuse and despair. A once rising star now cast out into the cold with no safety net and no support, forced to reinvent herself in the shadows, to fight her way through the darkness on her own terms. And it wasn't until the late 1970s and early 1980s, after years of recovery, after rebuilding her life from the ground up through faith, sobriety, and a refusal to disappear, that Grace found her way back to the Star Trek universe. First in Star Trek, the motion picture, and later in several feature films and fan productions, each appearance not just a return to form, but a quiet act of defiance, a reclaiming of space that had once been stolen from her. And at conventions, in interviews, and in personal letters from fans, she discovered that her brief time as Janice Rand had left an imprint far greater than anyone imagined, that viewers had always felt her absence, even if they didn't understand why, and that by telling the truth, by revealing the very real, very human story behind her disappearance, she had become more than a supporting actress. She had become a survivor, a voice for others who had been dismissed, silenced, or discarded, and her legacy, once limited to 8 episodes, became something far deeper. Because while she may not have had the screen time of Spock or the catchphrases of Kirk, Grace Lee Whitney lived one of the most important journeys in Star Trek history, a journey not across galaxies but through pain, recovery, truth, and resilience, showing fans that sometimes the strongest characters aren't written into the script. They rise from the truth that can't be erased. And today, when we remember Janice Rand, we remember Grace not just for what she portrayed, but for what she endured, what she overcame, and how she turned her silence into a message that will continue to echo through time like the stars she once walked among. And as Grace Lee Whitney re-entered the world of Star Trek not as the wide-eyed Yeoman Rand of the 1960s, but as a woman who had survived the full weight of betrayal, trauma, and recovery, she found herself standing on a different kind of stage, one no longer defined by lines on a script or directions from a producer, but by authenticity, vulnerability, and truth. Because as she began to share her story at conventions and in interviews, telling the fans not just what happened to her on screen, but what had happened to her off it, a transformation began not just within her, but within the way she was remembered. No longer just as a minor character or a background fixture on the bridge, but as a human being who had endured something so many others had suffered quietly and alone, and now had the courage to speak it aloud. And at those fan conventions, where people wore uniforms and badges and lined up for hours to meet their childhood heroes, Grace often found herself face to face with survivors of their own battles, women and men who had read her memoir, heard her speak, or simply felt something unspoken during those brief but impactful episodes decades earlier, and they would approach her, often in tears, sometimes in silence, just to say thank you. And in those quiet moments behind autograph tables and photo booths, she realized that her legacy was no longer about the lines she once recited, but the life she had reclaimed. And even though she never reached the top of the Hollywood ladder, never had her name in lights like Shatner or Nimoy, she had something deeper, a sense of peace, of purpose, and of connection with others who needed to see someone come back from the darkest places. And with each new Star Trek film appearance, as Janice Rand was quietly reintegrated into the universe from which she had once been erased, Grace reclaimed not just a role but a part of herself. Each scene a quiet act of healing, a symbol that she had not been forgotten, that her story still mattered. And in her later years, When the interviews grew softer and the spotlight gentler, she often spoke not with bitterness, but with gratitude, saying she had forgiven the man who had hurt her, not because it erased the pain, but because it allowed her to live without being defined by it, and she became a mentor in sobriety communities, helping others on their paths to healing. And for those who had followed her journey, her life stood as proof that even when a system tries to discard you, even when your name vanishes from scripts and call sheets, you can still write your story. You can still return, and you can still be seen. And when Grace passed away in 2015 at the age of 85, it wasn't just Star Trek fans who mourned, it was anyone who had ever felt silenced, overlooked, or broken by a world that moves too fast to notice the ones who fall behind. And her death marked the end of a long, complicated, and beautiful story, a story not of fame, but of survival, not of spotlight, but of strength. And today, as the Star Trek franchise continues to grow, and as new generations discover the original series for the first time, they still see Janice Rand standing by the captain's chair, still hear her voice delivering orders with quiet confidence, still feel the dignity she brought to every frame, and if they look a little deeper, they'll find Grace Lee Whitney's real legacy, not just a woman in a gold uniform, but a woman who walked through pain and came out with a message the whole world needed to hear, that no one is ever truly erased, that healing is possible, and that silence, when broken with truth, can change the course of an entire universe.